Hello and welcome to the Deep State Consciousness podcast. Today I'm joined by LuAnn Keener-Mikenas. LuAnn is a psychotherapist working in the United States and also has certain spiritual interests which no doubt affect her work, and that's what I'm going to be asking her about. So hello, LuAnn.
Hello, Richard. Good to be here.
Good to have you on. So tell us how it started for you. This seems to be a standard question I'm asking at the start of these interviews is, were you a spiritually inclined person who got into therapy, or were you a therapist who became involved in spiritual pursuits? How did your story play out?
I was always spiritually inclined, I guess, because I think I was having what I might call now mystical experience as a child. I started writing poetry as a child. And actually, the first half of my life, I was a poet and a teacher. I started to change careers in the mid-90s and started working in this career in 1996. So before that, I was teaching college English and writing and publishing poetry. And I remember making a conscious decision when I was about I guess about 32, 33, to look into Buddhism. I was raised Methodist, and then I wasn't active after I left my parents' home, and I started looking into Buddhism in my early 30s, around about the time I had a child. And one thing led to another. I just was kind of fascinated and just looking into one thing and then another and then another. So
does that coincide with when you moved from teaching work to therapy, that looking into Buddhism?
Well, no, it was roughly before that, because I started changing careers. I went back to graduate school in 1993, and I guess I'm talking about the late 80s, or around 1990, when I started looking into somewhere between 88 and 90. My son was born in 1988. So,
was it very accessible where you were in the US in the 80s, Buddhist literature and groups and that kind of thing?
Oh, yeah, it was. Not nearly so kind of omnipresent as it is now, but the insight meditation movement was strong, and there were tape recordings. Barre, Massachusetts, I believe, Wilkes-Barre, Vermont is where the Insight Meditation Center was at that time, still there, I'm sure. And that was a couple of teachers, Sandra Ingerman for one. I'm forgetting some of the other names. Jack Cornfield was in that group, and I kind of started there. I think I was given some recordings by a nurse practitioner friend of mine, and that was the first little link.
So I feel I skipped over what you said about childhood mystical experiences a moment ago. You had, maybe you could describe what was going on for you there, and if you had a context for them, or if finding out about spirituality and Buddhism later on allowed you to look back at those experiences in a different way.
Yeah, I didn't have a context at all. I just started writing poetry when I was about 10 years old. And I don't know, let me try and think about how that happened. I was always a reader, I guess, as a child, but my grandmother, who was sort of the icon of my childhood, started to develop Alzheimer's when I was 10 and died when I was 12. And I know that I started writing these little poems when I was 10, and I took them to Sunday school class. And they sort of made a big deal of them, and I just kept doing that. And then I think that probably with her death, that was probably became a place that I really did go into seriously as a kind of escape. My parents were both working very hard and pretty stressed, and my mother, well, both my parents also struggled with depression. So, and of course, you don't have a context when you're a kid. You are growing up in the middle of a context that to you is just the water in the fishbowl. But, I think that's probably how I would explain it now.
So were you writing poems about the kind of experiences you were having?
I was, gosh, I was wandering around. This was a small town in Texas, a town of about 500 people. I had a lot of freedom to wander around in the meadows and pastures and interact with the farm animals and so all of that was a very rich experience for me. And starting with I was when my mother started working when I was a very small child, I was spending my daytimes with my grandmother and on her little farm. So, I literally had little stories and scenarios going in my head with, the different parts of the chicken yard were different parts of the village, and the different trees were, different little abodes and that sort of thing. So I had this whole little kingdom in a way. And I think that just, so I do know that some of that early poetry was about some of that nature experience. And that, it seems to me, there's kind of a seamless, that's not separate from spiritual experience. I don't think of any, there does not seem to be a break in the continuum. Although when I was in my 30s, by that time, graduate school developed intellect, it was an intellectual decision to, I'm going to look into this with my intellect, but it was, and so that's always, I guess, in the way that Tim Freak talks about the two different faculties that we have of the scientific objective experience and the subjective mystical experience. I guess I was, I had both of those going by that time I was looking into Buddhism, but I didn't really think about them as separate or I didn't have the frame of reference for it that I have now.
And how was your experience of Buddhism? Did you find it transformative, or did it open up spirituality for you? What was that like getting into it?
It was just interesting. It didn't solve my problems, but it was interesting because so much of what I was reading and hearing about people's experience, basically, they're talking about experiences of learning to meditate or trying to learn to meditate, um, and I could. I also didn't know this at the time. I didn't know this until much later. But I have some pretty strong attention deficit symptoms, and so struggling with focusing and just managing stress and just getting hold of the mind as a set of racehorses, and just trying to get hold of that and slow it down. All that resonated, I think. But, and then I'm trying to think what would have been the next. I'm not sure what the next link in the chain was, but I think it just was a kind of slow continuum from that point on as far as interest in spirituality.
Okay, you said it didn't solve your problems. Were you going into it with problems you were hoping that spirituality would address?
I think so. I was very stressed as a young mother, stressed in my marriage, uh, still working and working in childcare and just managing stress and always trying to keep the writing going. That was probably the biggest factor. I had by that time, let's see, I published quite a bit of poetry, and in the 1990, I won a fairly major poetry prize, and so I was really trying to push that career, and at the same time, I was trying to be a mom of a baby and a toddler, and I don't think that I think for writers, I think work and parenting are always a struggle to some degree.
Yeah, sure.
And so yeah.
So then at some point the spiritual journey progresses and you become interested in psychotherapy. You must have become interested in it because you became a psychotherapist. So what led you
Yeah,
down that path? Because it's fairly dramatic to have a substantial career change at that point
yeah,
as well.
yeah. Well, it was partly circumstantial. It was partly that I had a lot of therapy myself, and I learned a lot, and it seemed to be very beneficial and very a very easy thing to take advantage of. And then my teaching situation at that time, in the United States, the universities were two-tiered as far as staff and professoriate instructors, which is what I was. Um, those were not permanent positions for the most part in the 80s. I don't know when that changed. It changed sometime in the late 90s after I left, at least at where I was, which was Virginia Tech. But those weren't permanent positions, so most people would, you do that for 5 years, and then you'd either go part-time or you would step into a permanent position at another university. And by that time, I was not prepared to move around. I had a child, and we had separated, and we were both figuring out ways to stay in the same geographical area, with our child. So I was looking for another career, and a poet friend of mine said, what else do you think? And just the first thing I came out of my mouth surprised me. I said, well, I could be a therapist. And so there were some programs close by to get retrained, and I very quickly got into that. And, yeah, and that turned out to be a very good fit because I'm best one-on-one. I'm not great in front of a room full of people. Still
Okay.
not.
And how did you find that experience of going through therapy and training in therapy contrasted with the Buddhism and the spirituality you've been involved in?
Contrasted. Well, and I guess you're talking about, therapy was very secular, and there was a lot of attention paid, I guess, careful attention by therapists to sort of stay out of the spiritual questions at that time. I don't know if that's where you're going with that.
Well, I'm going, I'll clarify, LuAnn.
Yeah.
I've had with previous guests, and what I'm interested to explore is the relationship, really, I suppose, between psychotherapy and spirituality, where they complement and where they contradict, and do they contradict? Okay,
Yeah.
so maybe in a sort of non-dual spirituality, you've got the sense of this, at the core, there is this deep acceptance that everything is okay as it is. There's no you that needs to be changed.
Yes.
And psychotherapy is, at least on the surface, about changing a you. So there seems to be a contradiction, but is there a contradiction? These kind of questions.
Yeah.
And I suppose also I'm interested in how you found them different in a transformational sense, like does sitting mindfully being with yourself open up transformation in some ways, like you would have done in the Buddhist practice, as opposed to, say, what you might have done in a psychotherapeutic setting of more going into your past and talking about where thought could have accumulated. They seem to be two different, maybe complementary ways of engaging with the self. And I'm interested in how people experience and find that, both with yourself and then, like we'll come on to, like with clients, and how that pans out.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think that goes right to the core of it. And I would say that putting that together for myself has been a very long and gradual process. So I did a lot with myself. I did a lot of processing of the story of the past for a long time. And I remember a therapist saying to me at one point, this was something that really stuck in my mind, that anyone who was in therapy over 35 had spiritual issues. And that may have been a trigger, actually. That may have been right around the time that I started to look into Buddhism. I can't exactly point to when it happened, but at some point the story of the past becomes integrated, and for me that has enabled me to get more and more and more into the present moment. And I think I'm a very late bloomer in that way. And then with clients, the way that translates from the other side would be that I think it's Carl Rogers that the unconditional positive regard is the single most consistent predictor of success, right, in therapy. And so that's always been kind of the central, the foundation stone of the work that I do. And just watching the way that works, and as I watch the way that works on a client, you know, learning more and more and more to do that for myself. But as I said, I'm a late bloomer. I've been very slow to mature, I think.
Well, that's, I mean, there's quite a few things there to unpack, but I mean, I think the thing about anyone over the age of 35 who's interested, now is interested in or going through therapy, has a kind of spiritual issue. I won't maybe dwell on why age 35 unless you wish to, but I wonder, how do you see psychological issues then maybe differently to a secular psychotherapist? Do you see issues that manifest in the psyche as always or sometimes or potentially having a more spiritual depth to them, that our spiritual yearnings masquerade as our dysfunction sometimes? Is that a position you take?
Let me think about that. Let me just drop back for a second and see if I can follow a train here, because, you know, having repeated what the person said to me about anyone over 35 with spiritual issues, I'm not sure that I buy that. I think it really rang a bell for me at the time, and I, you know, it was a big trigger. But I'm not sure that I can make any sense of that out of that now. In the first place, 35 to me sounds like just unbelievably young. And, you know, it's certainly, you know, do we not all have spiritual questions, issues, yearnings at any age? And, you know, that sounds so simplistic to me now. And I do see now, if there's one simple thing that I can say, one generality that I guess I'm still very comfortable with, it seems to be that perceiving the self as a victim is the quintessential psychological error that is, you know, that is a big obstacle that is sometimes very hard to move. And depending on how firmly stuck people are there or not, that's kind of a predictor of how fast they heal and move on and relaunch themselves, I think. So now, if you will restate your question, maybe we can totally connect my answer with it. I don't know.
Yeah, okay, because that's I think there is maybe a gap there between the question and the answer. So let's see if we can.
Yeah.
What was I'm lost in your interesting train of thought.
That's all right. You were saying,
do you see what we could call psychological dysfunction as having a spiritual root? So we've done away with the over 35 thing. Okay, we said at any age. So for example, it would be like our psychological issues arising out of a yearning for something deeper, that they're not immediately what they appear to be. So issues of the body, say, with appearance, do they point to a deeper sense of a search for meaning around what it is to be in a body, as a soul trapped in a body? So that's not a great analogy, perhaps, but I suppose what I find with people is when you enter into what appear to be quite often irrational streams of thought about themselves, then in the depths there is a rationality and a spiritual yearning that is going on. And I wonder, if you conceptualize things that way, and then your response was the sense of victimhood is something that...
Yeah. And the way I would describe that sense of victimhood is that there's the person has a sense of being cut off without resources, and doesn't have a sense of a core goodness or strength that is accessible. And then on the other hand, the next person might very well have that sort of, doesn't have the victim reflex and does have this sort of core goodness thing that is recognizable. And this may not have anything to do with, they may not have any formal spiritual tradition at all, or they may have one. You know, it doesn't seem to connect with whether or not they have a formal orthodox, connection there.
So are you talking about a perception of self there? How people fundamentally perceive?
I'm talking about a perception of self that might not even be conscious on their part. It's just a reflex to connect with, it's just kind of an innate kindness and a reflex to connect with that, as opposed to a reflex to that vibration of feeling victimized. And I know with myself, that quickly gets into, talking about experiences of mood changes, and I know that, what I can experience is I can get triggered into that place where there is a sense of isolation and not having resources and not being able to, help the self. And then I can get out of it, and when I'm out of it, my reality is just completely different.
So what does that transition then look like for you, and how do you affect it with clients that they could find a different conception of self?
It seems to have the most to do with how well I'm taking care of myself and how much I'm taking time to be in the moment. And when I'm being in the moment, the creative reflex is kind of automatically operating, and so there's a sense of being connected, to being. And so certainly the work that we've done. I don't know if this will make a connection in the context of the talk, but the work that we've done in Glastonbury has really given me a vocabulary for. It's been some of the most immediate experience of the being in the moment, and connected to being with a capital B that I've had, and so that's given me a kind of a frame of reference to plug some of my earlier, what I would say, mystical experience into, and it seems that it's a matter of sitting down and breathing and taking time and getting out of the intellect, out of the head, and that's not something that I've been really good at, I would say, until the last couple of years. So it seems like what is happening is that my work in my private practice is getting simpler and simpler. It's less about processing story and more about, once the story is received, once it's kind of in the basket, being in the moment, and breathing exercises, and just being in the moment with the person. Yeah.
So you mentioned Glastonbury, and just to give just to explain that for people, LuAnn and I know each other through Tim Freak's spirituality group in Glastonbury, which is all about really accessing this being with a capital B, which you talk about as being in the moment then, and with clients. And I suppose there's a sense then that's opening up a deeper sense of self, whether you're doing that from coming into the moment as the first port of call, and then that is in turn opening up a deeper sense of self, or however we're doing it, there's a sense of something transcendent. So I'm not just my limited individual self, but I feel connected to something beyond that. And I suppose for me, that's what makes all the difference in when I observe my own ability to transform my psyche, right? Because I mean, I say this quite a bit, but thoughts, it's as if like it should be easy to change thoughts and patterns of thinking, because we could close our eyes and think about anything, a bird, an elephant, a tree, anything. But if you try and actually change ingrained patterns of thought, you could easily knock a brick wall down or something. So they're really solid and they can last a lifetime. And what facilitates that change for me, I find, is being able to step into that deeper sense of being, where there seems to be then a separation actually between thought and my essential self. So rather than being entangled and not being able to see any distinction, where it's almost like I am any random thought that's arising in my mind, the self steps back and can see, go, oh, it's a thought down there that I'm looking at, and it's not me. Is it true? I don't know if it's true. It's not me. Definitely, maybe it's not true, and that can open up. Is that kind of
that's beautifully stated. That's it. That bit of difference between identifying with the thought and being able to step back. And so I do find myself talking to people a lot about getting a tiny bit of distance, and usually we're talking about some kind of reactive pattern that is happening over and over, and they're, and one day they'll come back and say, this almost happened, and I was able to stop, and I had a split second, and I didn't do A, and I actually realized, and then I did B. And so that whole discussion of that tiny bit of space seems to come up a lot in various contexts, and it does translate into behavioral changes.
It's something I know. It's one memory I have very clearly of one of the first times of going to that group, Glastonbury, and I was having a discussion with someone at a dinner table at a restaurant after the whole event had finished, and I can't for the life of me remember what we were discussing, but we definitely disagreed, right? So I mean, it's probably global warming, because that's something I often just have disagreed. Asylum on, but so let's say it was that. Okay, so I have my position and the other person had their position, and we were talking, and then at a certain point they just completely dropped their position and saw my position. Okay. And that was a bit startling to me, because it's not something that like regularly happens. And what I perceived was there was the cultivation of a deeper sense of self in the other person, which allowed the identity to be different from the position one holds. And that has like obviously psychotherapeutic implications for communication and just living as a human being that's not locked into one's opinions.
Well, I like that, and that's kind of giving me a metaphor that I will pick up and use, is that what it creates is a bigger room in which the self can stand in different perspectives, stand in different places and suddenly see something from a different angle. I often use the idea that the reality that we're looking at is a center of a circle, and we think about that circle having a gazillion windows all around it, and looking through a different window, you're going to see a slightly different picture of what's in the middle. So people can usually pick up on that. But that ability to, because when you think about the moment that you just described, I mean, for someone to actually drop their position and just step over to yours, there's so many other things that are involved there. There's so much of the ego investment and sense of identity with all kinds of emotional, stances and everything that would have to be loosened up and flexible in order for that to happen. It sounds kind of miraculous.
It is kind of a miracle when, so I mean, I thought about these things in the context of the kind of mystical, spiritual stuff of having a deeper sense of identity. And then I heard, I have a lot of friends who are big fans of Donald Winnicott, the attachment therapist, and one of them explained, he said something similar about when we have pure attachments to our parents, ideas can become attachment figures. So we lock onto them very solidly instead. It requires the cultivation of, no, I'm safe. I can put my ideas down. I can put my perceptions down, whether they're perceptions about myself or the wider world, and I can just be. And I could even pick up someone else's perceptions and try them on and put them down.
Yeah. Yeah.
But cultivate, and that seems to me to be the essence of therapy in life, is to be able to abide in that deeper sense of self.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. That's what that's bringing to mind is working with college students. Part of my work, I also work part-time in a college counseling center, and you know, you're often working with young people who are in that transition period between being adolescents and just sort of being in reactive mode toward their parents. Moving from that into a place where no matter what their parents want or don't want, they are giving themselves the freedom to make the choice for their own reasons. And so that, you know, I think that really, you know, you can take that little metaphor and keep applying it no matter what age you are, no matter what the pressures are, if you can get your balance in that space of the roomier self, and not allow the pressures to make the decision or you know, to determine the outcome.
Yeah,
then
well,
that's the real freedom. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
it's all right. As with people who are college age, if I think back to myself around that age, I think there's a breaking away from parents, school, and a finding of independence. And I recall it as a time where I became very locked on my opinions, actually, because they were my opinions for the first time.
Yes.
You know, like
Yeah.
I'd chosen them and
Yeah.
fight to defend them. And I guess it's similar then, because that's obviously the energy I see a lot with young people. They can become
Right.
quite militant, right? Most of them will transition out of that militance. Some maybe don't you go through life like that.
Yeah.
It seems to be like a developmental phase at that sort of youngest adult part of us.
Well, you know, I think a lot of us do. I guess I've made a reputation for myself at criticizing American culture. But I think that, you know, a culture that is so focused on entertaining itself is kind of locking itself down in that mode of, you know, this is what I want because I don't want these other things that are being represented over there. And so, yeah, I think we do. I don't think it's really the determinant of whether or not we outgrow that stuff. I think it's all kinds of other cultural factors that determine, you know, how much we really mature. I mean, obviously, we have a president who is very locked down in that mode, right? In sort of an iconic way. So.
Yes, I would say so. I don't know if you feel how many presidents haven't been. I don't generally think of US presidents as the emblems of psychological functionality, you know.
That's probably a good observation.
But the current one, it's
Yeah.
like the mask has come off to me, and you can really see that.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
very apparently.
the reactivity. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is it's a place I'm interested to go in, I suppose, a direction I'm interested to go, because we talk about spirituality in relationship to the therapeutic, so it's very much spirituality and the effect on the individual.
Yeah.
But collectively in society, I don't know, it feels to me like people on both sides of the Atlantic, right, are more entrenched in their opinions post Brexit here and Trump where you are. There seems to be a real locking down
Yeah.
and an unwillingness and inability to shift into the other's perspective at the moment, or to, it's almost like it would be treachery to abandon one's own positions and dangerous. You know, there's a sense of like real tension that's more than I can recall it in my adult lifetime. And maybe back, I know things were pretty tense in Britain in the 80s, okay, with Margaret Thatcher, but more than in recent years, I think there's like real polarization in society. I wonder what your thoughts are on that, looking at it from this perspective of a deeper sense of self and finding security in that sense of self.
Yeah, I think you're pointing at I think the core of it is fear, and I think that the more the scarier our planetary circumstances get, you know, the more people are literally vibrating with their fear, and that there maybe is kind of a survival reflex to latch on to something and hold on really tight and, you know, dig in deep. And so I see that, and I guess I see that in cosmic terms as kind of the program for forcing us to grow spiritually, because the scarier it gets, the more people, you know, what is it, the translation, the Chinese translation for the word crisis is dangerous opportunity. And so the more, and of course, you know, as therapists, we're trained that when someone's in crisis, there's about a 6-week window of openness that is not as open and available, you know, outside of that 6-week window. And so real change can really happen. And people are either, you know, scrambling around doing more and more dysfunctional things, or they are scrambling around looking harder and harder for, you know, for answers than they ever have before. That's sort of how I see it. And you know, clutching on to fundamentalist traditions of various kinds, or I don't know.
So how do you find yourself then in situations that might challenge you? If you fall into, and I don't know what positions exactly you fall into, but let's say then if you fall outside of certain positions that are strongly held by others, so I'll pick Trump supporter, maybe hardline evangelical Christian, as being positions that you wouldn't hold, okay, and may find, I don't know if repugnance is the right word, but be adverse to in some ways. And yet in your life, you must encounter people who wave the flag for Donald Trump and have got the red "Make America Great Again" caps on and that kind of thing. And
Right.
How do you find it interacting? Does the therapeutic, the spiritual, bring a different dimension to how you're able to interact with someone of diametrically different views?
Well, there's another kind of magical effect that I've observed over the years, and it, you know, continues stronger and stronger, and that is that the people that tend to show up in my office are the people that I can work with, and so there aren't a lot of people in red hats showing up.
Sorry, I meant more in day-to-day life, because I guess it wouldn't be that relevant in a new office. What?
Oh yeah, yeah.
In day-to-day life, how do you find that changes?
In day-to-day life, I guess I'm not running into them that much either. But that's a very interesting question that you bring up, because I started out as a college teacher, and my best friends are still from that group, and we still get together, even though I'm living in a different city now. But the whole question of how much do you want to engage the argument with the other side, whatever the other side is, and I've always been more of a person to kind of, you know, be the wolf in sheep's clothing and just observe and just sort of pass and just sort of engage a conversation at any level that I can. Not somebody who's going to directly engage the conflict. And I'm not sure why, but that's always kind of been my stance. But I like that stance, because I think you can, you know, if there's any kind of positive exchange going to happen, it's going to be through some little piece of commonality that gets discovered. And that can be, you know, it might be me that realizes, oh my gosh, look at this wonderful trait or this amazing thing about this person who otherwise, you know, I wouldn't be able to even talk to, because we're so on opposite ends of the continuum, you know. So I really have great faith in that I don't know what you would call it, but sort of that villager reflex, because I think we have to connect with each other. You know, we from opposite tribes have to be able to connect with each other one-on-one if the planet is going to sustain. So, well, I guess, that's off on another tangent, but I don't know exactly how that connects.
No, it does perfectly. I think it connects perfectly. The idea of finding like human value beyond the ostensible differences.
Yeah, and the intellectual arguments. Yeah. But you, I think you kind of back to the core question early on about how spiritual questions and psychotherapy, how those interconnect or wind up clashing with each other. Is that right? Is that kind of the bigger question you were trying to?
That was the kind of core question of the.
Yeah. And so, okay, I think I can say this: the whole what I get from both Buddhism and Christianity, which I was raised in, this idea that the core is love, and if that is remembered and we can stay closely enough in touch with that, then everything else sort of falls into place. And so I will find, just a kind of blow by blow experience in the office that I often have is someone starting out with a client who may just present as very, very difficult in the beginning. And I may find myself thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? How is this going to work? Depending on, how rested or how tired or stressed I am to start with as well. But then within a few, I would say usually by the third session, of sort of staying out of the intellect and trying to stay in the space of, I don't know, just kindness, just sort of expressions of kindness in a very basic personal way. And I suppose that, I can justify that on the one hand by saying it helps the person stay safe, but it also helps me stay out of all the different emotional, transference places that I might get triggered by the difficult stuff, that they're presenting, the personality reflexes that they may have and so forth. So, and that might be outside of the therapy office, that might be the very same dynamic happening on the street. If, we're over here demonstrating for A, B, or C, and the person passing by is on the XYZ camp. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally, yeah.
And
I think there's very much a sense on both sides of the spectrum that if I could just find a big enough hammer to hit my opponents with, to hit the people who don't think like me,
right,
then I win. And the internet has in some senses provided that hammer, because it's different to relating to someone face to face. It seems like when you move from face to face relationality to posting on Facebook or putting YouTube videos up, the first thing to go is a sense of the shared humanity, and you can just be as cutting and brutal as that part of your mind will allow you to be. And there's a sort of heaviness to the energy of a lot of political videos I find on the internet, even if I agree with their content, because they're done with the intention to insult or denigrate those who disagree. And I think this is maybe the internet, as well as being obviously this amazing thing which has given us access to all this information and is allowing us to record this conversation now, it's also allowing for a kind of lowering of standards of how you might address people. Okay, so I see a lot of YouTube videos of so-and-so has destroyed so-and-so's argument, and it's this really kind of, and that's not the worst of it, quite a long time. I mean, the term libtard comes into my mind as a reference to liberal, right? And I'm sure there's an equivalent term on the other side, but that's just one that's popped into my mind now. It's not really a productive way to start a conversation when you've insulted their intelligence and worldview, like right in the title of your video. You know?
Yeah. Well, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt you.
No, that was my so it's almost like people are they're not really making those videos or those posts to convince anyone else. It's kind of an echo chamber where they're wanting to reinforce their own opinion with like-minded people.
Right. Yeah, I'm aware of that phenomenon, and I don't spend very much time, actually looking into it and being part of that conversation, but I'm aware of it, and in my eternal optimism, I think that eventually it will sort of sort itself out, and there'll be, kind of a 100th monkey phenomenon somehow where an ethic will be born out of it, an ethic of interacting that will be, will just, trump that whole ugly thing that can happen. As soon as you started talking about it, what I went to was it's just like the road rage phenomenon. Yeah. And I do experience that. And I will, I'll see myself, there's some guy in a truck with giant tires, and I'll see myself having this reaction, and sometimes cooling it and just hanging back, and sometimes not cooling it and hanging back. And it's really interesting to watch yourself fall into that, you know. And it's just a thing that it's just another place where we're trying to learn to be mindful, I guess. And we are slowly and painfully learning to be mindful, I think. The more outrageous we become on the public stage, we have so many public stages now. Everything is a public stage. Yeah. So.
And it is also a time that not only have we just gotten access to all this technology in this form of information consumption and creation, but also the availability of spirituality and the therapeutic implications of that have only just become available, like on a grand scale. And this is like coming after what has been, for thousands of years, it's been quite traumatic to live as a human being. Okay, if your life didn't involve heavy trauma, you were pretty lucky. I mean, even if you weren't, dying in a war or sold into slavery or the bubonic plague or something, you probably lost like 6 children in childbirth. That was just one of the mill, right? So there's generational trauma coming right down, and then you can see this kind of like probably the latest manifestation of one form is anger on the internet. It's like we all carry this wave of energy that's coming for humanity, and there is also now the opportunity to actually address that.
Yeah.
Like as individuals might get to a point in their life where they address their childhood trauma. Say it could be that human beings as a species address their childhood trauma. If you consider the Middle Ages and prior to that, a bit after that, as being like humanity's childhood, if you like, if we're able to step out of that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And the technology, of course, is moving so much faster in the way it's developing than we are. It forces us to speed up, and it speeds us up too, I think, because the more tools we have in our hands, the faster we self-destruct and or evolve, I guess. That's
depending how you use it. Yeah,
I hope. Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating time to be alive. Are you familiar with the I guess you would call her a modernist thinker, Jean Houston?
I'm not.
She's someone that I was listening to. There's this wonderful program coming out of San Francisco starting in the 70s called New Dimensions, and I think it may still be being produced, but that was a big sort of cornerstone of my new consciousness education, definitely starting in the mid-70s. And just every Friday evening was a new new consciousness thinker of some kind in an hour-long interview. And Jean Houston, oh gosh, I can't really summarize who she is or was, but she was one of those people who was experimenting for the government with psychoactive substances, including LSD. In the 70s. She and her husband, I think, were literally working doing that. She was also a friend as a child of Teilhard de Chardin.
Mm-hmm.
And she's just a wonderful thinker. But one of the last times that I was listening to one of her things on that show, she was talking about, she would, and I believe this was in the 80s, she would go on the internet and pose as a 15-year-old boy and talk to people all over the world. And then she would pose as a different, psyche entity, and just to find out, what are the teenage boys around the world thinking? What are the what is this other group of people thinking? And I guess she gave me the positive spin on the internet early on, that it was the nervous system of the planet, hooking up and waking up, and that it was, while it was capable of great evil, if you will, it was also giving us this fantastic ability to evolve and become, more than we were. And I think about that a lot. And I don't use it because I don't use it very much at all. I'm really not that comfortable on it. I'm not sure why, but I'm glad it's there.
Okay, thank you very much for the conversation, man. Does that sound like a good place to conclude for now? Maybe we'll talk again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a lot of fun.
I'm just aware you have poetry books, right? Maybe we could talk about your poetry sometime. But are they available for? Can people see your poetry, or are the books available?
Well, I have a couple of books that I think you can find on Amazon. I have a website, and they're available there. And yeah.
So I'll link to all that in the description box of whatever platform people are listening to this on.
Okay.
Thank you, LuAnn. And
Sure. Thank you, Richard. It's really a pleasure.